Hello Year 10, I hope you're all well and you're keeping up with the work that I've been setting you for history. I've missed you so much and I'm sorry that I can't be seeing you in the face-to-face lessons that you've been having in these final few weeks. I've made a short video that will talk you through this booklet and most importantly the 3 question styles that you need to be covering for this paper. So hopefully this will help you feel a little bit more confident about tackling this part of paper 1. On the front page of your booklet, which I've copied on this slide, you can see a syllabus checklist. I'd be really grateful if you could go through each statement and rag it red, amber, green, as we normally do in our lessons, so that I can see how confident you are with the topics. At the bottom, you'll see the work that's been set for each week, and we're going to focus on the work of the 29th of June onwards, which are the 3 exam questions that I'd like you to complete. This is part of paper 1. It's the same paper as the Medicine Through Time paper. It's got 2 completely new question styles on it, but one that you should be familiar with. The deadline for this work is Friday the 3rd of July, and I'd be grateful if you could send it to me via my school email. Details are on Show My Homework. I can then read through each of your answers, give you a mark for each question and give you some more detailed feedback. Okay, so the first question we haven't studied before and it's called a feature question. It's really straightforward and it's worth 4 marks. Feature just means fact. Each feature is worth 2 marks, making a total of 4 marks, and you'd have about 5 minutes to answer this question. So for example, the examiner will give you 1 mark for your first feature and then 1 mark for any extra detail that builds on that. And then you repeat for a second completely different feature. Now there are 2 common mistakes that are often made by students with this question that loses them unnecessary marks. The first mistake is that they don't always read the question carefully. So for example, if the question was, describe 2 features of the symptoms of trench foot, if I told you about the treatments for trench foot or the way it was prevented, I wouldn't score any marks because it's not details of the symptoms. The second mistake that's commonly made is that students don't have 2 completely separate features. They often include more of the same. So the examiner will cap their mark to 2. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of this with something that will be really familiar for you. Let's imagine that the question says, describe 2 features of the recent return to school for Year 10 students. I might write in a 4-mark answer. One feature is the smaller size of classes. Students now find themselves returning to a classroom of only 8 students, all arranged in socially distanced bubbles. A second feature is that only core subjects have been able to offer face-to-face lessons. This has meant that students have spoken with their English, maths and science teachers but have not had the opportunity to meet any of their other subjects' teachers. I've given 2 completely different features and back them up with some examples. So I would score 4 out of 4. So let's have a look at this for the question that I'd like you to complete. At the back of your booklet, you've got these 3 different question styles and there's actually 2 examples. Your homework, or your home learning, is to complete the first example of each. So in this case, the question is, describe 2 features of the effects of poison gas attacks on soldiers. Now look at it, it's the effects. I've included the paragraph on page 14 just to revisit the topic so that you can get the information that you need quickly. You will have made notes of this in your booklet on page 15. What I'd like you to do is to stop this video when I've stopped talking and highlight the facts that are relevant to the question, and then I'll show you the answers. Okay. Right, let's have a look at the answers that you should have got. The first part of the paragraph is all about prevention and protection and it gives some examples of gas used. The last part of the paragraph talks about the treatments given. What we want is the symptoms, the effects. So I've highlighted those in red. Did you get the same? Hopefully you did. Okay, so let's have a look at a support writing frame. In the exam, the paper actually does say 1 feature and it gives you some lines, and then it will say another feature and it will give you some lines. So I might write 1 effect of poison gas was, for example, and another feature of the effects of poison gas was, and if, for example, isn't helpful for me to be using. So I'm going to suggest that you use this writing frame, adapt it if you need to, set a timer for 5 minutes and answer it, perhaps using the information that I've highlighted in red, taking two different features and backing each one up with a short example of information. So stop this now, have a go at answering it, and I'll reveal the answer. Okay, here's my example of an answer. One effect of poison gas was a few soldiers lost their lives. Now let's build on that feature. For example, 5% of British soldiers died in gas attacks. Okay, now we need a second completely different feature. Another feature of the effects of poison gas was that if a soldier was poisoned, they would experience coughing, blindness, loss of taste and smell. And these symptoms might disappear after 2 weeks. So I've given a fact and I've built on it. I would score 4 out of 4 for this. Hopefully you did. If you didn't, add some notes in green pen to your booklets. Okay, so let's have a little look at the second question. This is a difficult question because students make silly mistakes on it. It's worth 8 marks and you've probably got about 15 minutes. It should be familiar to you because we've studied it in our Germany booklet, and we spent a lot of lessons having a go at this using tables. I don't know if you can remember NOPCAT tables in the Germany booklet, but I'll talk you through it again. So this question asks you, how useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into the system for dealing with injured soldiers on the Western Front? So the relevant information that we're looking for is how they dealt with soldiers who were injured. And in your answer, you're going to use sources A and B and your own knowledge of the historical context. It's worth 8 marks. If you don't include your own knowledge, you cannot score higher than 2, and that's what we see a lot of students not doing and therefore losing really necessary marks. One way that you can remember a checklist that will help you answer a usefulness question is by using the NOPCAT OK approach. I'll break that down into the 3 parts. The NOP stands for the nature, the origin and the purpose. That's all about the source description. The nature is what it is. Is it a diary, a photograph, a letter, a report? The origin is who wrote it and when. If it was somebody like a surgeon, then they'd be quite an expert and we'd refer to them as an expert insider. If it was written by an ordinary person, then it would be a worm's eye view. So those are 2 phrases that are new for you. An expert insider and a worm's eye view. And the purpose is, why was it written? Was it written to inform and educate people? Was it a private diary entry perhaps, or something private, not intended for public reading? Is it written to persuade? Was it written to persuade? Maybe be a piece of propaganda? Sometimes sources are made to entertain, but that's probably unlikely for this topic on World War I. Another thing that we need to comment on is the content of the source, and students usually do this really well. If it's a written source, they'd sum up the main ideas, they must add quotes if it's a written source, and make inferences from those quotes. The final thing that they need to do is then apply their own knowledge to say if they think the source is accurate and typical. This is what they often don't do. So let's have a little look at those 2 sources and see how useful they are for an inquiry into the system for dealing with injured soldiers. Before we actually look at the sources themselves, let's have a look at the source descriptor and let's identify strengths and weaknesses of the NOP. So if you can stop this presentation, can you jot down in a table strengths from source A and weaknesses from the NOP in source A, and strengths from source B and the weaknesses for the NOP in source B. Remember, we are not looking at the photograph itself or the written description. Okay, I'm going to reveal the answers now. You can see that source A is a diary. It's written in 1915 by somebody who experienced being injured in the war and in the early years of the war. So a strength would be, well, the fact that it's a diary, it's got quite a good nature. It gives a regular account of what was happening to somebody. It gives a worm's eye view, if you like. That's the origin. He was a soldier who was injured and is writing at the time. And also the purpose. Because it's a diary, it would probably be private, and therefore there's no reason to lie or reason to exaggerate. However, a weakness is diaries only show one person's opinion, and sometimes we don't want to generalise too much from one diary. You'd want to look at several sources to see if they're typical experiences for the many people. He might be biased in his opinion and judgment. Also, the date, it's really useful in showing us what the evacuation process for injured soldiers was like at the start of the war, but it's written in 1915, and it might be that towards the later years of the war more advanced treatments were discovered, so the origin has some flaws there, some weaknesses. If we have a look at source B, a strength of this would be that it's a photograph, so it shows us exactly what's happening. We can see where the soldiers are, how they've been cared for, what provisions are in place for them. However, it's only capturing one moment in time. We don't know what happened previously or afterwards, and it only shows us one part of the scene. We don't know if there are double the same number of soldiers on the other side of the road, for example. And the origin, a strength of this, is that it's 1917, so we can say it's really useful in showing us what the evacuation process was like towards the end of the war. But the purpose is a weakness. We don't really know who took it and why it was taken. Was it to inform and give information and educate the person looking at the photograph? Or was it taken to influence opinion? Was it a newspaper photographer, for example, that took the picture to show how desperate the men were? Now let's have a look at the content. I'd like you to read through source A and highlight any quotes that you think you'd refer to in your answer, and just note any inferences that you think are helpful. And then also have a look at source B and draw lines coming out from a couple of points of the picture and tell me what you can infer from that, therefore showing how useful the content of each source is. Okay, I'm going to show you the answers now, so if you haven't finished that, stop the film and have a go at doing it. Okay, so there's quite a lot of information and we do need to be selective. So I'd say that the first way that source A is useful is it does give us some good information about the numbers of soldiers injured and the capacity that the RAMC staff had in dealing with them. The fact that it says our stretcher people are so busy suggests that there were more casualties than they could cope with. And that's also supported by the fact that they were told to manage to get back by ourselves. The fact that it tells us that it took all night is helpful in showing us that actually evacuation process was very slow. The RAMC staff kept coming in but don't seem to be able to mend me up. That shows us that there's limits to the medical help that could be given in the first stage of evacuation, most likely a dressing station. And also it tells us that I shall have to go to a field hospital for a week. That gives us a little bit more information about the stages of evacuation. If the dressing station couldn't provide support for you, then you'd move on towards a field hospital or a casualty clearing station, or beyond that to a base hospital or even back to a hospital in Britain. So it's quite helpful in showing us the stages of evacuation, dependent upon the level of severity of injury. If we have a look at source B, this is really helpful in showing us that outside this dressing station there are men waiting to be taken on to a casualty clearing station. Again, it's supporting source A in showing us that there's a problem with capacity, with too many injured soldiers to be treated at any given time. The fact that they're lying on the ground shows that there might be a shortage of beds inside the building. Also, it shows us how soldiers were evacuated. You notice, whereas source A talks about movement on foot, here we can see further back from the front line trenches, they're being evacuated in motorised vehicles, in ambulances. Now we need to look at the final part of the NOPCAT OK and use our own knowledge to build on some of those facts given to us in the sources. So the facts that I might refer to for source A is that I know that stretcher bearers would be sent out to collect the injured soldiers and bring them to dressing stations or move them on to casualty clearing stations. I know that this was a long process that took all night because of the terrain. They were walking over muddy, waterlogged shell holes, which would have been very slow to have navigated their way across, and very dangerous as well. The evacuation was often on foot because vehicles simply couldn't collect the soldiers from no man's land. Even horses and carts got stuck in the mud. It's really useful in showing us about the limits to medical help, and we know that, for example, in dressing stations, really bandages and morphine for pain relief are the only things that they had. And most leg breaks, for example, and he references a damaged leg, might be treated in a casualty clearance station or even in a base hospital. Operations would happen and more detailed care would happen in those later stages of support of treating injured soldiers. If we have a look at source B, the photograph, I might like to pick up on the point that I know that Arras was an underground hospital. There were lots of casualties, which would explain why there's numbers of soldiers lying outside waiting to be taken on to a casualty clearing station. And I might also make reference to the fact that I can see here ambulances, and that I know that in the last few years of the war there were more vehicles being used in the evacuation process, driven by first aid nursing yeomanry members, or fannies, nurses. Very dangerous and a very slow process. And you can see here, further back from the front line, they are travelling on roads, but it would have been dangerous and they would have still been a target. So I've talked you through NOPCAT, and what I'd like you to do now is to write 2 paragraphs, one on source A and one on source B. If you want to, you can go through the NOP followed by the content and then look at your own knowledge. Or what some students like to do is start with the content, then add their own knowledge to build on it, and then comment on the NOP at the end. You don't need to include a conclusion at the end. You don't need to say which source is the most useful, although several students find it useful, if they've got time, to just sum up how each source is useful. So for example, I might write source A is most useful in showing the evacuation process at the beginning of the war and in the early stages, so showing how soldiers were taken from the no man's land to the dressing stations or casualty clearing stations on foot. And source B is most useful in explaining the evacuation process in the later years of the war, where you can see that there was a greater use of motorised vehicles and ambulances. So when you write your answer, you can use the blue writing frame on this slide to help you. And give yourself 15 minutes, no more, to write your answer. Okay, we're going to look at the last question, the follow-up question. It's only worth 4 marks. Probably a maximum of 10 minutes to do this by the time you've read the source and written the answer, 5 to 10 minutes. Students really struggle with this one, and I will show you exactly where they lose their marks. So the exam will actually have these 4 statements written on the right hand side of your screens actually in the paper. The first thing you need to do is to read the source and pick out a detail in the source that you want to follow up. This would simply be a quote that you copy in quotation marks. If you're shown a picture, then you might describe an element of the picture that you can see. A question that you would ask. You've got to make sure that you're writing a relevant question that matches the details in the source that you've copied up. If you need to look back at the question and make sure that the details that you've chosen match the focus of the question. So in this case, it's casualty clearing stations. You would include your quote and the details of the source based on casualty clearing stations, and a question based on that quote. And it's really important that those 2 answers for the first 2 parts of this 4-mark answer are relevant and related, because when the examiner gives you marks, they give you 2 marks at a time together, tied together for those two parts. Then you move to the second part of the question. What type of source could I use to find out more about it? It needs to be a different type of source. And then how might this help me answer my question? So the next slide just goes over that with some specific examples. Let's have a look at the source. It's from a medical surgeon, it's from a Surgeon General for the medical services giving orders to a casualty clearing station in April 1916. He says, owing to the fact that modern battles as a rule last several days, care must be taken that NCOs and men of your casualty clearing station should be divided into day and night parties, of which of course the day party will be the larger. As far as possible, some officers and sisters should also be off duty for at least 6 hours in 24. So we need to identify a quote that we can then ask a question, a follow-up question, that's going to give us more information about casualty clearing stations. If you look to the right-hand side of your screens, the first bit's obvious, copy a quote. The questions that you could ask could begin with the words why, what, how, when and where. Make sure it's relevant to the focus in the question that's being asked. Then what type of source could I use? You could choose a diary from a soldier or a diary from a fanny nurse. You might include an RAMC medical report from the time, or an event, or even from a particular area. You might choose to refer to an injured soldier's record cards, their medical cards, or photographs from the time. And then the last part is, well, how would this help me answer my question? you need to show the examiner some of your own knowledge about this topic. It would give me information such as, okay? And those last two statements are also paired together when the examiner awards marks. So worst case scenario, you get no marks for this. Then you might get 2 marks if you have only one pair matching with relevant answers. Or you could get 4 marks, but very rarely do we see 1 mark or 3 marks awarded, because as I've suggested, the first 2 and the last 2 statements or parts of your answer are paired together when the examiner marks it. Okay, so here's my example of an answer. I'm going to pick up on the point that it says some officers and assisters should be off duty for at least 6 hours in 24. And I'm going to start with the answer actually were. Not where, were. I haven't included that in my circles. So I'm going to say, were nurses able to get at least 6 hours break each day when working in casualty clearing stations? So what type of source could I use? Well, it lends itself to a nurse's diary entry. And how might this help me? Well, it would tell me exactly how long they typically worked for. It should show me how exhausting the work was during the time of a battle and the hours that were needed responding to the casualties. That has the potential, that statement, to go off topic. So I need to bring it back and say, I could then see if the recommendations of source A were followed and the nurses did get their 6 hours break in every 24. Okay, so there are your 3 questions. There are 2 options here. The easier option is to use the guidance in this video to answer those 3 questions. Try and do it yourself and try and answer the questions in the time limits that you've been given for each question. So the first one is 5 minutes for the features question, the usefulness question is 15 minutes, and the last question, the follow-up question, give yourself a maximum of 10 minutes. Really 5 is what we're aiming for. If you fancy a bit more of a challenge, please do that, but then have a look at the second set of questions in your booklet underneath each of the firsts. I would suggest that you actually answer questions 1 and 3 in full because they're so quick to answer, but maybe just make bullet point notes, maybe in a table if you want to, with NOP and then the content and then your own knowledge to test accuracy and typicality at the end. And you for question 2. If you could please email that to me on my school email by Friday the 3rd of July, that would be really helpful, and then I can look at it over the weekend and the start of the following week and email it back to you with a grade, a mark for each question and some feedback of what you need to do as an IAC task to make progress. I hope that presentation's helped, and I look forward to hearing from you. And as I said, I miss you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful final few weeks of term. Don't hesitate to get in touch if you need any more advice. Thanks so much.